This is the safest tool I think I've ever seen.
That's the table saw!
Hi, I'm Tom. Welcome to the Woodshop Nerdery. This video is a response to the video released on the John Malecki channel regarding the Shopsmith Mark V system. The video is so packed of misinformation and mischaracterization, it's borderline appalling. I shared my opinion about the Shopsmith's safety in both the thumbnail and in this video opener. In my opinion, I think it's as safe as any other woodworking system. And I'll go into detail about the facts supporting that opinion later on in the video. In regard to misinformation, we've got to start with the thumbnail. I believe this is a picture of John's Shopsmith that has been doctored to make it look like he has 2 amputated fingers and several bandages along with blood strewn everywhere. Looks like the same scrap board that he drilled 2 holes in the drill press demonstration. And if you look at the board right around the miter gauge, you'll see those 2 holes. And it also appears in the background to be the same floor as in his shop, as well as that yellow extension cord. And every other detail about the Shopsmith machine, including the blade, is identical. I can't say for sure, of course, but in my opinion, it looks like the image had been doctored up rather than being an authentic image of a real accident. As an example of mischaracterizations, clips of John Malecki struggling to set up the machine for the first time are commingled with him using the machine for the first time. And I don't think I ever hear him distinguish between one-time setup tasks and something you have to do every time you use the machine. Of course, every woodworking machine has those one-time setup tasks. I could go out and buy a brand new saw stop and have it dropped off here in the garage and take a bunch of video of myself cursing and whining my way through getting it out of the box and setting it up, and then say at the end of the video, it's garbage. We could do that sort of shtick with any machine of any brand name. It doesn't really distinguish one tool from another. They're all like that. Best I can tell, what he's trying to do is mimic kind of the workflow and skill set and activities that he thinks his general audience or his normal viewer would engage in when buying a used Shopsmith. And maybe that's true. Maybe his standard viewer doesn't read manuals, or maybe they don't follow safety precautions, and maybe they don't know how to use tools or work on equipment. I guess in that regard, I do agree with the larger point of the video. If you're not going to use saw guards and you're not going to read manuals and you don't know how to use tools and you're not willing to learn any of those things, then probably it would be a bad idea for anyone to recommend to you any type of power tool. If someone were to come to me and say, hey Tom, I want to get into woodworking, but I don't want to learn a bunch of safety rules, I don't want to use any saw guards, is there one power tool that you would recommend for me? I would recommend the bandsaw. The reason for that is because the bandsaw blade moves in a linear motion. It doesn't pose the same hazards as a table saw blade, which moves in a circular motion. So, for example, kickback is not really a problem on a bandsaw. It's just inherently less risky. There's another comment at the beginning of the video in relation to how many used Shopsmiths there are on Facebook Marketplace. I think his point is, if they were so great, why are so many of them for sale? I actually think that that's evidence of how good the system is, not of how bad the system is, like John seems to be saying. How many other 30-year-old pieces of woodworking equipment do you think are for sale on Facebook Marketplace? There are some examples. There are tools like the old Delta table saws that people really go after. The reason that these are on Facebook Marketplace and not in the dumpster is because they have a saleable value. It's because they still work. It's because they are a high quality machine. I don't see anything from Harbor Freight that's 30 years old for sale anywhere. It's probably in a landfill somewhere because it broke and it wasn't worth repairing. And there's even older Shopsmiths out there going all the way back to the 50s that still hold a few $100s of value in the used market. And that's because people like those old machines. They still run. You could still do woodworking with them. Think about it. In 1993, maybe someone in their late 50s, early 60s who had just retired or was about to retire and thought that they would do woodworking as a hobby in their retirement. And they went out and they bought this equipment, whether it's Shopsmith or some other brand, and they loaded it into their garage, and maybe they used it and maybe they didn't. Maybe it turned out they just weren't cut out for woodworking. That's something that can happen to any brand of tool. It's not isolated to Shopsmith. But what does seem to be prevalent in the Shopsmith world is that so many of them are still working 30 years later. So that guy who was in his late 50s, early 60s in 1993 would be well over 80, maybe even 90 years old today. And it's quite possible that someone at that age has either passed away or experienced a major change of life, and the tool comes up for sale. So the fact that there's so many available in the used marketplace at pretty good prices is actually a huge benefit. If you see one of these in a garage sale or in the used market and it's a good price, I'll say again, consider buying it. You don't have to use it as a table saw if you think it's too dangerous. It's got so many other usage as a sander, as a bandsaw, as a jointer, as a belt sander, drum sander, and many other things that could possibly help you elevate your woodworking. At the beginning of the video, I thought it was kind of strange how John said something like, if these are such great machines, why don't you see anyone using them? Well, I see people using them all the time. It's possible that the reason he's not seeing anyone using them is because he didn't look. There's actually several content creators in addition to myself who make YouTube content either using or related to Shopsmith equipment. There's Nick Angler of the Workshop Companion. There's Scott Markwood of My Growth Rings. There's Doug Reed. There's Michael Young from Today's Shopsmith. And some of you may know this guy, who famously used the Shopsmith system for some operations in the New Yankee Workshop, particularly the early seasons. So there are plenty of people using Shopsmith systems. Perhaps none of them are the big-time content creators. They're just guys like me in our garage workshop enjoying woodworking. I want to mention quickly that the Woodshop Nerdery is a hobby-level channel. I don't do affiliate links. I haven't monetized the channel. I don't accept free products. I don't accept money from sponsors. And I never will on this channel. I think it's perfectly fine to run a YouTube-based business. I'm certainly a believer in entrepreneurship and self-reliance. And hey, someday in the future, I might run a little business on YouTube as well. Who knows? But for this station, I'm keeping it 100% hobby level so that you all can have the most trust in the motivations I have for doing the things I do and saying the things that I say. So this is the first Shopsmith I ever purchased. I've shortened it quite a bit to make it what's called a shop deputy. But this is the same model that John bought in his video. It's a Shopsmith 510. And John gives a close-up shot of his manufacturer's tag, which shows that the date of manufacture was June 8th, 1993. My date of manufacture is March 14th, 1991. So this machine is about the same age as the one John showed. They're both over 30 years old. I bought this machine about 9 years ago for some home remodeling projects. And after those projects were done, I realized that this machine works so well that I could become a serious woodworker with this equipment. If you know a little bit about tools or how to follow a step-by-step manual for maintenance and upkeep, if it's a good price, go ahead. You could do this. You could cut it down and you could make one of these shop deputies. You could make a sanding station like this one. I don't think you can find another sanding station like this with this build quality and a 1 1/8 horsepower motor. I don't think they exist. In his video, John seems baffled by the claim that the Shopsmith bandsaw is the most powerful 11-inch bandsaw on the market today. Although I don't have definitive proof that it is the most powerful bandsaw on the market today, I think it might be, and it's kind of easy to explain why. Keep in mind the headstock has a 1 1/8 horsepower motor in there. I looked through the specs on a couple of tool websites this morning looking at 11-inch bandsaws, and all of them had 1/3 horsepower motors. That motor is way more powerful than any of the 11-inch bandsaws I saw specs for. The 4-inch jointer is another tool that seemed to have really baffled the John Malecki crew over there. I have used this jointer quite a bit, but only after I took some time to learn how to use it, reading the manuals, watching videos, and so forth. One of the concerns that was mentioned was that maybe taking the tool on and off the machine would cause the fence to go out of square. I've taken this tool on and off the machine. It's been in storage over there for a really long time. It's not a tool I use all the time. Let's go ahead and check to see if the fence is square to the table. There you go, square. Now, I never rely on that. I always check if it's still square. And just like I always check my bandsaw blades to my table and my table saw blade to my table, it's always a good idea to make things are square before you power them on and run lumber through them. And I would do that for any power tool. What I found a little bit confusing about some of the scenes in the video is after spending several minutes talking about how dangerous this tool is and how risky and how scared he was, he went ahead and took a board and ran it right through the jointer just with his fingers. It would seem to me if someone was really scared of this tool, all you'd have to do to mitigate most of the risks associated with this machine is use push blocks. These push blocks come with the Shopsmith. Put one here to keep it against the fence, one on top to push it through, and there you go. That's one of the things you would do on any joiner of any size to mitigate the hazards associated with this type of tool. There's a point made about the fence being too short, that after you get the workpiece out here, it can flap around because the fence stops here. That's common on jointers to have a pretty short fence here. The Grizzly one that John recommended instead of this one has a fence that goes from about this point to about this point, and I think you move it back and forth to the position that you want it. This fence has a little bit different approach. It has a hole here and a hole here. Those are for screws. So you can take any board of any size. Hopefully you're a woodworker, so you know how to make a board, and just screw from the back side into your auxiliary fence, and then you have something that is as long as you want it or as long as you need it. There is one point John makes about the joiner that I do kind of agree with, and that's the price. He compares the price to a Grizzly at I think around $300 and so and a Jet at almost $900. But the Jet has a helical cutter head, so that explains some of the additional cost. The Grizzly model he showed was a pretty mid-range jointer with a cast aluminum table instead of a cast iron table, and a really kind of short fence as well. Personally, I wouldn't spend the money to buy a new Shopsmith joiner, but then again, I wouldn't spend the money to buy that Grizzly either. I wouldn't buy any jointer. In my opinion, I think jointers have been made effectively obsolete by high-quality carbide table saw blades. These modern blades with their high-quality carbide teeth and the advanced steel plates they're making these days can get glue-ready finishes right on the edge of boards. There really isn't so much of a need to maybe clean up edges with jointers anymore if you know how to use and set up a table saw. Now there are going to be some cases where you maybe have an irregular side, but there are techniques to joint irregular edges safely and accurately on the table saw. There's videos all over YouTube showing that technique. I should say that the reason I have this jointer is because it came used with this original 510 Shopsmith system that I bought. And since I have it, I do use it from time to time. John Malecki correctly points out that this is a 4-inch jointer, so when it comes to face jointing, the maximum width you're going to be able to do is 4 inches. That's perfectly okay for face jointing 2x material like this piece of cedar here, but of course anything wider than 4 inches is not going to work. For me, when I have boards that are wider than 4 inches, I don't think about going out and buying a new 8-inch jointer. I really don't want one in the shop. You can see this one rocks back and forth, so what I would do is take these two corners and kind of mark them as the high spots. Then I would just shave those down here and here until it no longer rocked on my bench. That's not perfectly flat, but it would be flat enough to run through my 12-inch thickness planer with that side down, which would true up this side of the face, and then I could flip it over and finish truing up this side of the face. In the drill press section of the video, John makes a comment that it's a left-handed quill feed. Yes, his quill handle was installed on the left. For anyone who cared to do any sort of research, will realize that it can go on the right, it can go on the left, and I switch mine back and forth all the time. I do have these upgraded quill feeds that have these 10 position holes, which are super convenient, and there's a magnet that holds it on. It's just beautiful. So here you can see on my old Shopsmith the quill handle attached to the left hand side. I just unscrew it, I can take it off, and it's really not a problem to come around here and attach it to the right hand side. One of the parts that I found the strangest in the video was the wood turning section. It seems like John was saying that he didn't know how to turn wood or use lathe chisels, and you know what? I don't either. I've done very little turning in my hobby. I would like to get into it in the future, and with this Shopsmith I certainly can do that. And because I'm not a wood turner, I don't have any bowl blanks, so bear with me and just pretend that this can of Johnson's paste wax is a bowl blank. To my eye, looking at the video, this is the distance between the tool rest and the bowl blank as John set it up in the video. So I'll tell you, yeah, if you are that far away from the workpiece, it's going to be awkward. I feel like if tool rest was a little closer to the workpiece, that it might have been a little more comfortable. Also, John made a comment about how the bowl blank wasn't supported on this side. As far as I understand is possible on the Shopsmith, let me show you how that would work. So to my understanding, if I wanted to support this side of the bowl blank, I would obviously install my tailstock, and I have a live center here. Go ahead and move my carriage all the way to the right. And I'll bring my headstock over to within striking distance. So now obviously my tool rest is not in a position where this is going to work, so I will need to take it off and change it from this hole to this hole. So to support this side, I would extend the quill. Okay, lock it down, and now I have pressure on both sides. What's sort of strange is that he gives it a thumbs up as a lathe, even though he was so critical about the machine, with apparently not much turning experience. So I'm not sure how valuable that recommendation is to people anyway. One thing he does say is that the motor doesn't have much power. I think he says something like it doesn't have any balls. In regard to the lathe and its power, this is a 1 1/8 horsepower motor, and as a lathe it has a 16-inch capacity. I did some research looking at other 16-inch lathes from other brands online, and they're all around 1 horsepower. So the Shopsmith system is right in line with the competition. I'll say that listening to the audio in the video, it could be that his headstock needs a little maintenance. After all, it is a 30-year-old machine, and yes, if you're going to buy a 30-year-old used machinery of any type, a car, a motorcycle, whatever it is, there's going to be some maintenance. I think maybe his belts are not properly tensioned, or maybe they're old and cracked and dry out, and he's just not getting good power transfer from the electric motor to the shaft. If that is the case, that's pretty easy to correct with maybe a new belt, which isn't that expensive, and some minor adjustments. It's possible that a little bit of maintenance will restore some of the power to his headstock. In my experience, this is a very powerful machine for all of the tasks that I asked it to do. Just so you know, when you see a steel tooth blade like this with tons of teeth on it, it's for plywood. It may even say it right on the side of the blade. In the video, John is really concerned about that set screw on the saw blade arbor. This is a little bit different one than he showed in the video. It's used for the most common 10-inch table saw blade today, which is a 5/8 inch arbor. I'll get back to that set screw in a minute. It's really not an issue, and I can prove that to you. There was a moment in the video where the table saw was powered on and it made a horrendous noise, and that was blamed on the set screw coming loose on the shaft. It was not the set screw coming on the shaft. What had been done is, when setting up the system, is that the table was not put in the correct position relative to the headstock. See how that table saw blade is touching the side of that insert? That's because I inched the headstock over to the left. If I push it all the way to the right, notice that the table saw blade is right there in the middle and perfectly clears everything. Then I just tighten it down and lock it right here. The way that works is really foolproof as long as you remember to push it over. There's this rubber collar that perfectly spaces the distance between the table carriage and the headstock. Let's take a close-up look at this table saw blade and the table saw arbor set screw. First, I'll say this is the lower saw guard. It also supplies the dust collection facility. If you buy a used Shopsmith and it does not come with one of these, do not set it up in table saw mode and do not turn the machine on. Go to eBay, go to Craigslist, Facebook, whatever, and pick up a second-hand one of these lower saw guards. You can easily go to Shopsmith's own website and order this part brand new if you wanted to pay new prices. So something to look at here is the flat on this arbor. It's right there. And hopefully you can see that it's a reverse taper, meaning that it's fatter on this side and then slopes in and down as it gets closer to this collar. So you'll notice that this flat is aligned with this set screw. So I'm going to line my set screw with that set screw and I'm going to lock it down. And it's pretty easy. You can give it a little wiggle to make sure it's set right in the correct location. Give it a little twist. If I want to give it a little more juice on that screw, I can turn my Allen wrench sideways and then use the long part of the shaft as a lever to get it a little tighter if I want. In the video, John raises somewhat of a bizarre concern, if you ask me, about the table saw blade flying off the machine. First of all, it's retained by the lower saw guard, it's retained by the table and the table insert and the upper saw guard. If it were to come loose, it wouldn't get very far. But I will say, from time to time, it is possible for this set screw to become a little loose. Or perhaps the user doesn't tighten it properly. I don't ever recall that happening to me, but I have heard other people talk about it. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and break that screw. Okay, so there it is snug. I'm going to give it a quarter turn and now it's a little loose. But notice it doesn't spin on the shaft. It's still registered to the flat, and if I try to push it this way, it doesn't get very far, does it? Right? It's still stuck on there. The reason it's not going to come off with that little bit of looseness is because of that tapered shaft. It's running up the hill of that taper and bottoming out. In order to take the saw guard off, let's count the number of turns. There's a half, still won't come off, a full. Okay, I could just barely get it off at a full turn. So in my opinion, it's unlikely that the table saw blade will fly off the machine, assuming you've read the instructions and installed it the correct way. As strange as the video has been up to this point, and as confusing as some of the statements are that were made, there are a couple things at the end of the video that were just completely befuddling. John sets up for a compound miter cut, and it looks somewhat like this. He spends some time describing how dangerous it is and how you'd be better off with a compound miter saw and so forth. I do agree with that. I do agree that if you'd be making lots of compound miter cuts, you might want to invest in a compound miter saw. But I don't make a lot of compound miter cuts. I make very few, maybe a set every other year. I'm not going to invest in a tool just for that. I think he called anyone who would do this a lunatic. And you know, it's not exactly the most normal way to make a compound miter cut, but it does work, and it can work well if you take the time to set it up. John does explain how dangerous he thinks that this operation is, how sketchy it is, but he does go ahead and make the cut anyway, which actually sort of surprised me after he spent so much time talking about how dangerous it was. I can give you a 10-second trick on how to make this situation a lot safer, and it goes like this. There you go. It's, you guessed it, a saw guard. In this case, I'm not going to put my hands on either side of the blade. It's pretty common table saw safety instructions that you don't reach around the blade, although there's exceptions to every rule. What I do is I stand to the side. It's a perfectly sized table for this, and just move it like this, almost like I would be using a jointer. My hand is over here behind the miter gauge. My other hand is gripping the grip here. All my digits are at least 4 to 5 inches away from the blade, and I just go ahead and make the cut. Something else that confused me, which was you can make compound cuts on this table saw, which you normally can't do on a table saw. I'm not sure what he's talking about, but as long as the blade of a table saw can change angle relative to that table, and as long as you have a miter gauge that can change to any degree other than 90, you can make a compound miter cut. And I think that's most table saws ever sold. Maybe you might not know how to do it, but it can be done. Also near the end of the video, he holds up the miter gauge and said, if you lose this thing, you're screwed. And he says something very similar a little later on in the video. Yeah, if you lose your miter gauge for your table saw, you're not going to be making crosscuts, unless you have some other way to do it like a crosscut sled. That's true of every table saw, so I just was sort of confused at why he said that. The only thing I think he might have meant is that the width of the miter bar on the Shopsmith is not the same size as every other table saw. I don't remember the exact dimensions, but I think it's about a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch skinnier than most table saws. So maybe he meant that if you lose this, you can't take the miter gauge off of another system and use it on your table saw. You have to have one dedicated to the Shopsmith. Well, that is true, but I don't think you're necessarily screwed. You can buy these used all day long for about $40 to $50 on eBay. And you can even buy one of these new from shopsmith.com. As we get towards the end of the video, I have to fulfill a promise I made to you at the beginning, which is to talk about safety. I stated my opinion that the Shopsmith systems are the safest tool in woodworking. What I mean by that is, in my opinion, Shopsmith equipment is as safe as any other machine of the same type. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, it can't be as safe as a saw stop table saw because it doesn't have the automatic blade braking system to prevent amputations. And that's true. It doesn't have any type of automated braking like that. But that's not the whole story about safety. I look at safety as not danger or something that I react to emotionally. Of course, I do react emotionally, but I have to balance that out with logic. And I find that one of the best ways to do that is to think of those dangers as risks. And the classic equation for risk is to somehow quantify the likelihood that an event will occur and somehow quantify the consequences that would happen if that event were to occur and multiply those quantifications together, and that's your risk value. So if you're multiplying these two terms together, you can reduce the risk value on the right-hand side of the equal sign by lowering either the likelihood that something will happen or addressing the consequence that would occur if that thing were to happen. SawStop's automatic braking system operates on the consequence portion of that equation, meaning the brake doesn't prevent hand to blade contact. It reduces the consequence of that hand to blade contact down to almost nothing. Therefore, the risk of hand to blade contact is down to almost nothing as well. My Shopsmith equipment, on the other hand, operates on the likelihood side of that risk equation. I have saw guards that prevent my hand from touching the blade. I have push blocks and push sticks that help me keep my hand nowhere near the blade. And there's also things like feather boards, which keep the workpiece up against the fence and prevent the workpiece from turning and climbing on top of the blade. And in my opinion, when I use the table saw with those safety features installed and using the techniques that I use, that the likelihood of my hand touching the blade is almost zero. Therefore, the risk of amputation is almost zero. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I'm not saying I couldn't have a bad day and forget to install the saw guard or make some other mistake, but you can also disable the electronic device on the saw stop as well. So there are user mistakes in both areas that can lead to a disaster for sure. So looking at those two safety strategies, one in the Shopsmith case, which reduces the likelihood that an event will occur, and on the SolStop side, one that reduces the consequences should that event occur, both result in lowering the risk value to a very, very low value. So that's why it's my opinion that the Shopsmith systems are just as safe as any other table saw or bandsaw or disc sander or jointer, for example. Hey, if you think I've gotten something wrong, leave a comment. I really don't have any problem with civil criticism down in the comment section. After all, it's a comment section, not a compliment section. So go ahead, if I missed something, if I have a factual error, anything at all, go ahead and hit me. So yeah, I found John's video pretty bizarre. I mean, there were several things I listed in this video that just didn't make sense. I really do feel it was misinformation and a mischaracterization. But I do believe that John Malecki is a smart guy. I mean, he's running a business, he's selling t-shirts, he's got a woodworking class that he offers, he gets lots and lots of views. He's an intelligent person who's figured out how to use YouTube to make money. So it kind of begs the question, why does he look so dumb in the video? I honestly think he was putting on an act. I think this video had no planning. They just went and picked up the machine and filmed it in real time, and anytime there was a little struggle, he kind of exaggerated it. I've not had those struggles setting up the machine. I did all those same things that John struggled with in the video by myself. I mean, I'm a woodworker after all. If I need an extra hand in my woodworking, I use a clamp. If I need an extra hand setting up a machine, I can use that same clamp. So I think John Malecki was just trying to make an entertaining and engaging video that people would click the thumbnail and they would watch and they'd be interested in watching the whole video. And one of the ways he can keep people watching is sort of playing up the clown and playing into the comedy of errors type of aspect. After all, he's got to keep you watching long enough to sell you a t-shirt, right? But I did feel compelled to make this video because I believe that the Shopsmith system is something people can consider. I won't recommend it for everybody. If they see one for a good price in the used marketplace, there's lots of people like me who really like them and are very successful using them to make projects. If you'd like to see some of the projects I've made, please check out my other videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.